Episode 1: Taking Responsibility and Setting Priorities. Q1: How do you decide what to prioritize when you have too much on your plate? Honestly, it took me years to get better at this. Early in my career, I treated every task as equally urgent, which just wasn't sustainable. Now I try to ask one simple question first: what actually matters most right now? Usually that becomes my first priority, and everything else gets slotted in around it. I've also learned to give priority to tasks that unblock other people, not just the ones that feel most pressing to me personally, because if I'm the bottleneck, the whole team slows down. It's not a perfect system, but it saved me from a lot of unnecessary stress. Q2: Do you think people should always accept responsibility for their mistakes at work, even small ones? I genuinely think so, yes. It's tempting to explain away a small error, but I've noticed that people who accept responsibility quickly, without excuses, tend to earn far more trust over time. There's a difference between panicking and simply saying, "That was on me, here's how I'll fix it." I try to assume responsibility early rather than waiting for someone else to point it out, because by the time that happens, the damage is usually bigger than it needed to be. Q3: What's the difference between having a high priority and a minimum requirement for a project? A minimum requirement is the baseline, the thing that absolutely has to be true for a project to even count as finished. A high priority, on the other hand, is more about urgency and importance relative to everything else on your list. Something can be a high priority without being a strict requirement. I think a lot of workplace conflict actually comes from people mixing these two up, treating a nice-to-have as if it were mandatory, or ignoring a genuine minimum standard because something else feels more exciting. Q4: Can you describe a moment when you had to become aware of a problem you'd been ignoring? There was a stretch, maybe 2 years ago, where I kept dismissing small complaints about a process at work as one-off issues. It wasn't until 3 separate people mentioned the same friction point that I finally had to become aware that it was systemic, not incidental. That moment was humbling, realizing I'd been so focused on my own tasks that I missed something obvious to everyone else. Q5: What role does a manager play in helping a team stay focused on what matters? A good manager plays a genuinely crucial role here, not by micromanaging, but by protecting the team's attention from constant distractions. I've worked under managers who took on a major role in shielding us from unnecessary meetings and shifting priorities, and the difference in output was massive. When leadership doesn't do this, everyone ends up guessing what actually matters, and the final product suffers because energy gets spread too thin across too many things. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 2: Strategy and Planning. Q1: How important is it to develop a clear strategy before starting a big project? Extremely important, in my experience, though I used to underestimate this. I once jumped straight into execution without taking the time to develop a strategy, and we ended up redoing half the work a month in. Now I insist on spending real time at the planning stage, even when it feels slow, because that upfront thinking saves far more time later than it costs at the start. Q2: Do you personally have a strategy for managing your career, or do you take things as they come? A bit of both, honestly. I do have a strategy in the sense that I know roughly what kind of work I want to be doing in a few years, but I try not to plan every single step because opportunities rarely show up exactly the way you expect. What I've committed to more seriously lately is genuine strategic planning around skills, deliberately choosing what to learn next instead of drifting. Q3: What are the advantages of using a modern method over a traditional method at work? A modern method often takes advantage of tools and data that simply didn't exist when a traditional method was designed, so it can be faster or more accurate. But traditional approaches usually carry hard-won wisdom. They've been tested over time, and that matters too. I generally favor an effective method over a fashionable one. Whether it's old or new, what matters most to me is whether it actually gets the job done reliably. Q4: How do you decide which method or approach to apply to a new type of problem? I usually start by looking at how similar problems were solved before, then decide whether to apply a method that already exists or build something new. If there's already a standard method the industry trusts, I'll default to that unless there's a clear reason not to. Reinventing the wheel rarely pays off unless the old wheel is genuinely broken. Q5. Can you think of a time your original plan didn't work and you had to consider an alternative method? Definitely. A project I worked on hit a wall about halfway through. The approach we'd chosen just wasn't scaling. We had to pause and seriously consider an alternative method, which felt frustrating at the time because it meant admitting the first plan wasn't working. But switching turned out to be the right call, and it taught me not to be too attached to a single strategy just because we'd already invested time in it. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 3: Resources and Efficiency. Q1. How do you decide how to allocate resources when there isn't enough to go around? This is one of the hardest parts of any project, honestly. When you have to allocate resources across competing needs, someone inevitably feels shortchanged. I try to be transparent about the reasoning, explaining why one area gets more budget or people than another, because even when people disagree with the decision, they usually respect it more when they understand the logic behind it. Q2. What do you do when you have limited resources but ambitious goals? You get creative mostly. Working with limited resources forces you to cut anything that isn't essential and focus only on what genuinely moves the needle. I've actually found that having fewer available resources sometimes produces better thinking than having plenty. Abundance can make people lazy about prioritization. Q3. Do you think natural resources should be managed differently by governments versus private companies? I think natural resources need a mix of both, honestly. Companies are good at using resources efficiently when there's a clear incentive to do so, but without oversight, that efficiency can come at a real cost to the environment or to future generations. Governments need to make available the right regulations and protections so that short-term efficiency doesn't quietly become long-term damage. Q4. What are the benefits of using a widely used tool or platform instead of something niche? A widely used tool usually has more support, more documentation, and a bigger community to ask for help. It's also frequently used enough that new hires often already know how it works, which saves training time. The downside is that popular tools aren't always the best technical fit. Sometimes a smaller, more specialized option would actually serve you better, even if it's less common. Q5. How do you make sure information or a service stays easily accessible to the people who need it? I've learned that something being technically available isn't the same as it being genuinely easily accessible. A document buried in 10 folders might exist, but practically speaking, no one can find it. I try to keep processes relatively straightforward, clear naming, clear locations, because complexity quietly discourages people from using the resources you've worked hard to provide. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 4: Challenges and Problem Solving. Q1. What's the biggest professional challenge you've faced recently? Honestly, a major challenge came up last year when a key client changed their requirements halfway through a long project. It wasn't quite a serious challenge in the sense of threatening the business, but it forced a lot of rework under time pressure, and managing everyone's frustration, including my own, was harder than the technical problem itself. Q2. How do you usually respond when you encounter problems you didn't anticipate? I try to pause before reacting. When you encounter problems you didn't see coming, the instinct is to panic or assign blame, but neither actually solves anything. I found it's more useful to just name the problem clearly first, then figure out who's best placed to help. Sometimes that's me, sometimes it isn't. Q3. Have you ever had to work through a genuinely complex process that felt overwhelming at first? Yes, definitely. There was a complex process involving several departments that none of us fully understood end to end. Everyone only knew their own piece. As the project grew, the increasing complexity became genuinely stressful, and it took deliberately mapping the whole thing out on a whiteboard before it stopped feeling chaotic. Q4. What do you do when a task turns out to be highly complex or when you experience real difficulties completing it? When something is highly complex, I try to break it into smaller pieces rather than attacking it all at once. That alone removes a lot of the anxiety. If I experience difficulties I can't solve alone, I ask for help earlier than my instincts want me to. Waiting too long just compounds the problem. Q5. Can working under pressure ever have a direct impact on the quality of decisions people make? Absolutely, and not always for the better. Pressure can have a direct impact on judgment. People start cutting corners or reacting emotionally rather than thinking clearly. That said, I've also seen pressure make an impact in a positive way, pushing a team to finally resolve something they'd been avoiding for weeks. It really depends on whether the pressure feels manageable or overwhelming. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 5. Information and Communication. Q1. What makes someone good at conveying complicated information clearly? I think the best communicators know how to convey information without drowning people in unnecessary detail. They know what actually needs saying and what can wait. I've worked with people who could extract information from a messy, complicated situation and hand you back 3 clear sentences. That's a genuinely rare and valuable skill. Q2. How do you make sure a presentation gives people enough factual information without becoming boring? I try to lead with factual information they actually need to make a decision, and save the extra detail for questions afterward rather than cramming it all into the main talk. When I give an overview of something complicated, I usually sketch the big picture first, then go deeper only where people show interest. Q3. What do you do with given information that turns out to be incomplete or possibly wrong? This happens more often than people admit. If given information looks incomplete, I flag it immediately rather than quietly working around the gap, because guessing usually causes bigger problems later. Once you start to process information you don't fully trust, it's easy to build an entire plan on a shaky foundation. Q4. How important is it to know your target audience before you provide information to them? Hugely important. What you provide information about, and how you phrase it, should shift completely depending on your target audience. A technical team needs different detail than a client does. I've made the mistake of using the same explanation for both groups before, and it landed badly with each of them for opposite reasons. Q5. Is it useful to look at a recent study before making a business decision, or is intuition enough? I think both matter, honestly. A recent study can validate or challenge assumptions you didn't realize you were making, which is genuinely useful. But data from a study rarely captures every detail of your specific situation, so I try to provide an alternative perspective alongside the numbers, asking what the data might be missing, not just what it says. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 6. Innovation, Technology, and Change. Q1. How has modern technology changed the way your team collaborates? Enormously. Modern technology means we can work across time zones without losing much momentum, something that would have been nearly impossible a decade ago. That said, it also means expectations have shifted. People now assume you'll respond quickly just because the tools make it technically possible. Q2. Do you think structural change within a company is usually good or disruptive? It depends entirely on how it's handled. Structural change can genuinely improve how decisions get made and who's accountable for what, but if it's rushed, it mostly just creates confusion and anxiety. I've seen reorganizations succeed only when leadership took the time to explain the reasoning clearly instead of just announcing a new chart. Q3. Can you describe a time someone brought a genuinely new perspective to a problem your team was stuck on? Yes, a newer colleague once questioned an assumption the rest of us had stopped even noticing we were making. That fresh new perspective completely reframed the problem, and honestly, it was a little embarrassing that it took someone unfamiliar with our habits to see it. It reminded me how valuable it is to keep bringing in people who haven't been shaped by the same routines. Q4. What role does intellectual property play in how companies think about innovation? Intellectual property shapes a lot of strategic decisions. Actually, companies sometimes hold back from sharing ideas openly simply to protect what they've built. It plays a pivotal role in industries where the underlying idea is the main asset, though I do think an overly protective mindset can sometimes stifle collaboration that would benefit everyone. Q5. How specifically designed does a product need to be for a particular audience versus being general purpose? I think it depends on the market. Something specifically designed for one narrow group can feel perfect to that group but irrelevant to everyone else. A more general, holistic approach trades some of that precision for wider appeal. Neither is universally better. It comes down to whether you're trying to delight a small audience deeply or serve a much larger one adequately. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 7. Standards, Quality, and Performance. Q1. How do you make sure your work meets a genuinely high standard, not just an acceptable one? I usually build in a step where I ask, honestly, whether I'd be comfortable if this were reviewed by someone I respect. That small accurate measurement of quality, comparing against a real standard rather than just good enough, pushes me to catch things I'd otherwise let slide. Q2. What does careful analysis actually look like in practice? For me, careful analysis means resisting the urge to jump to conclusions before I've actually looked at enough evidence. I try to lay out what I know, what I'm assuming, and what's still unclear, rather than blending all three together in my head, which is where most bad decisions quietly start. Q3. How do you present clear evidence to someone who disagrees with your conclusion? I try to lead with the most clear evidence. I have the one fact that's hardest to argue with, rather than overwhelming them with everything at once. If there's a significant difference between what I believe and what they believe, I find it's more productive to ask what evidence would actually change their mind, rather than just repeating my own points louder. Q4. Do you find that different projects have similar characteristics, or does every project feel completely new? Honestly, most projects share similar characteristics once you've done enough of them. The same kinds of risks, the same kinds of miscommunications. Results can still vary significantly in outcome, but the underlying patterns are surprisingly consistent, which is part of why experience genuinely helps, even in fields that feel fast-moving. Q5. What happens when a team assumes results will remain unchanged, but the situation shifts? That's a mistake I've made myself, assuming things will remain unchanged just because they've been stable so far. When conditions shift and no one's paying attention, problems become immediately obvious far too late to fix cheaply. I've become much more comfortable now with regularly questioning assumptions, even ones that used to feel safe. Q6. Do you think a team with great diversity in background performs better on average, or is that overstated? I genuinely think it helps, though I understand the skepticism. A team with great diversity and experience tends to catch blind spots that a more uniform group simply wouldn't notice. Different backgrounds mean different assumptions get questioned. It's a relatively common finding across the projects I've been part of. The teams that struggled most were usually the ones where everyone thought alike from the start. underscore 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 underscore. Episode 8: Growth, Environment, and Reflection. Q1. How has your previous experience shaped the way you approach new projects now? My previous experience has made me a lot more cautious about overcommitting early. I've learned the hard way that enthusiasm at the start of a project doesn't always survive contact with reality. I've also gotten better at recognizing the main function of a task before diving in, instead of getting distracted by interesting, but ultimately secondary details. Q2. Can you give a typical example of a decision that was heavily influenced by external pressure rather than pure logic? Sure. A typical example would be rushing a launch date not because the product was actually ready, but because a competitor announced something similar. That decision was clearly heavily influenced by fear rather than strategy, and, honestly, it showed in the quality of what we shipped. Q3. What are the benefits of offering people a great range of options versus a narrow, curated one? A great range of choices can feel empowering, but I've also seen it backfire: too many options and people freeze up entirely. What actually seems to work is offering a genuinely useful set, curated thoughtfully, rather than every possible option just to seem generous. A high percentage of decision fatigue, honestly, comes from unnecessary choice. Q4. How important is it for a company to genuinely offer an opportunity for growth, rather than just talk about it? Hugely important, and, honestly, easy to fake in words, but hard to fake in practice. When a company claims to offer an opportunity for advancement but never actually follows through, people notice quickly and trust erodes fast. I'd rather work somewhere that underpromises and consistently delivers than the reverse. Q5. Do you think companies take environmental protection seriously enough, or is it mostly about appearances? Honestly, it's mixed. Some companies genuinely commit to environmental protection as part of how they operate, factoring the natural environment into real decisions, not just marketing. Others treat it as decoration, a nice line in a report that doesn't actually shape behavior. I think the difference becomes obvious pretty quickly once you look at what a company actually changes, not just what it says. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 9: Projects, Places, and People, Bosung. Q1. What usually determines whether a project counts as a successful implementation? For me, a successful implementation isn't just about finishing on time, it's whether the thing actually gets used the way it was meant to. I've seen projects technically completed on schedule that quietly failed because nobody adopted them afterward. So I try to check in weeks later, not just at launch, to see if it's genuinely working under real, appropriate conditions rather than the ideal ones we tested in. Q2. Does the geographical location of a team affect how a project gets planned? Definitely more than people expect. A team spread across different time zones has to plan very differently from one sitting in the same office. The geographical location of collaborators shapes everything from meeting times to how much gets decided asynchronously in writing rather than live conversation, something I underestimated until I actually managed a distributed team myself. Q3. What's something small, like a form you had to hand in, that turned out to matter more than expected? Oh, easily. Once I had to hand in a routine compliance form I nearly skipped as unimportant, and it turned out to contain a detail that changed how a whole contract was structured. It's a good reminder that some of the most boring paperwork quietly protects everyone involved, even when it feels like a formality. Q4. How seriously should companies take informed consent when collecting data from employees or customers? Very seriously, honestly. Informed consent isn't just a legal checkbox, it's about genuinely respecting people's right to know what's being collected and why. I've worked somewhere that treated it as pure paperwork, and it showed in how casually data was handled elsewhere too. The two tend to go together. Q5. When handling large quantities of data or requests, what's the biggest risk? Mostly, it's losing the human detail in the noise. When you're processing large quantities of anything, it's tempting to treat everything as a statistic rather than an individual case, and that's when mistakes that matter to real people start slipping through. Some situations are also genuinely potentially dangerous if handled carelessly at scale. A small error repeated 1,000 times becomes a much bigger problem than the same error made once. Q6. Is it useful to take in feedback from every source, or should you be selective? I've learned to be selective, actually. Trying to take in every piece of feedback from every direction just leads to paralysis. You end up trying to please everyone and satisfying no one. I now try to weigh feedback by how directly it relates to the actual goal, rather than treating every opinion as equally valuable just because someone bothered to share it.